Hey guys, thanks for tuning into Audio Post-Production 101. My name's Tom, and we've already covered the basics on our dialogue edit, as well as done a pass on cutting background ambience for this film. I covered a couple scenes last time. I have the whole film done with the dialogue edit and the backgrounds edit, so we're ready to move on to the next type of sound effects. So we've covered our backgrounds and or ambience, depending on what you want to call them. So now we've got hard effects, which are the traditional sound effects like doors, guns, cars, punches, all that kind of, realistic sound that is driven by what's on camera. And then we've also got sound design. I tend to count sound design as like more of the elements that actually need to be created either from scratch or with a lot of processing and work. So if it's taking a sound and manipulating it or creating a new sound, I'll categorize that as sound design. And on bigger shows, like I've said before, these are all different people working on each of these. And hard effects will even be split up further into things like, let's say, vehicles and doors and fight, which would be punches and cloth movement and whooshes and bone crunches. Speaking of that, gore. Sometimes gore is broken out. What else do we have? Animals. Sometimes creatures will be in this, but generally they're in sound design. So it'll just depend on the film, how you want to split these out. But using these, what a lot of people call food groups, we will lay out our session to make it easier to mix these with all these different food groups. It's really nice when you have a team working on it because, hey, one person's going to deliver all the vehicle tracks, one person's going to do maybe all the doors plus any of the special props that need to be edited, and then you'll have one person do the fight and or the gore, and so on and so forth. So instead of just having, like 10 sound effects tracks where everything's just thrown in, the director might say, hey, I really like what you've done with the mix. I just want to bring all the punches up 3 decibels. Or you might have a really busy scene where there's cars and there's hand-to-hand combat, like maybe they're on top of the cars punching each other, and there's gunfire. I should really add that to this food group list. Weapons are super important to have split out. So when you're mixing a scene, you're going to want to take each of these food groups and have them on a separate VCA, which is a fader that will control a whole bunch of tracks. That way you can get a global balance between all these different elements versus just turning the sound effects stem up or down. So it really helps with the mix. It also helps when you're editing because hey, I've got all the vehicle tracks covered. I've gone through the whole show. I can go to my next set of tracks for weapons. Back in Pro Tools, I'm not going to rename this session. It's already called Sound Effects Edit. To me, that's good enough. If I wanted to, I could call it Hard Effects Edit or Sound Design Edit, but sound effects, I'm going to keep them all in one session. So I'm going to add a lot of tracks for this. There's, not in this scene, but in other scenes, there's quite a bit of action. So this part will depend on your particular film. If it's just like a mumblecore type, 3 guys talking in an apartment for 90 minutes, Sundance winner, then you might not need a ton of sound effects. But as I went over with the food groups, even if you don't need a ton of sound effects, it will help the mix out to have them split up. So you might only have, 4 vehicle tracks. Maybe they get in their Prius and go to the Whole Foods market in one scene. You don't need a ton of tracks for that, but you're going to need some. You'll need some doors, and you might not need any of this other stuff, but you'll need to have them categorized somewhat. Like I've said in the other videos, I like to do 8 and 16. I'll do 4 if I know there's not going to be a ton of mono tracks, for example, like I did with the backgrounds. But for this, I'm going to add 8 mono audio tracks, and I'm going to call this A sound effects mono. If you wanted to, you could label this as, vehicle sound effects, for example. That way the mixer knows, even if you're mixing it, you'll know, hey, on these tracks, it's just vehicles. But I'm just going to call them A sound effects. And I'm going to do 8 stereo, A sound effects stereo. So I've got M for mono, ST for stereo. And then I will just continue that to cover however many groups I think I'm going to need. Hopefully I've gone through and watched this movie and know exactly what categories are going to be needed. So make sure you do that. Maybe even get a spotting list for each individual sound. That'll let you know what kind of layout you like to use. I'm just going to keep going here. 4 mono, so I'm going to call this one B mono sound effects. So as always, check with the mixer on how they want the tracks laid out. Some of them are going to want, one group to only ever be vehicles, one group to only ever be doors, and so on and so forth, so that they know for any scene, they just have to grab this VCA for this group. And they can even name the VCA like, hey, this is my vehicle VCA. Other mixers, for example, if they're just mixing with one session and they don't want a super heavy track count, they might want you to keep the sound effects tracks down to like under 100 tracks or maybe even less. All they're going to care about is having, for each scene, separation between each group. So that means that on one scene where you have a lot of car stuff, you might have A be the hero car, the protagonist, and B be the cop cars that are chasing him. That way the mixer can do a 2-finger dance back and forth between the two VCAs. And then they might want like the hero weapons on C and the bad guy weapons on D. That, it just makes it easier to mix. So check with the mixer. If you're mixing it, figure out what works best for you. I like to do kind of a hybrid where I know most of the sound effects that are like doors or everyday stuff is going to be on A because there's more of that stuff. And then I'll have, for example, fight and gore on B. For C, because C is the first letter in car, I'll have C be the vehicles. And then D, for this, I'll have maybe be sound design or any of the extra stuff. But for a scene where it goes back and forth, then I'll start to break it out just based on what scene. So the most important thing is just to think ahead to the mix and make sure you're cutting for the mix. Because if you just have, 16 total tracks and you're just throwing all your sound effects on there, that's going to be a nightmare to mix. Unless it's a movie of the week for the Hallmark Channel or something, and then it doesn't really matter. This 2-minute scene that we've been really focused on for this series, there's not a ton of sound effects. There's some phone pickups and ringing and, some sitting down, but it's extremely light on sound effects, so it's not the best example. So I'm actually going to go to different scenes in the film where there's more work to be done. But one thing that's really helpful to do, and also helps if you're splitting off work to different sound editors, is to have a spotting track or spotting tracks. You might even have like sound effects spot vehicles, for example. And then what you can do, just like our picture cut track, is highlight a time selection and do Option Command G and just type what kind of sound effect that is. You might even, if you want to be really specific, say, you might even name it like 2012 Prius with stolen cat. Very popular in Portland, the Prius without the catalytic converter. That way, either or the other people that are helping you with the sound effects editorial know exactly who's doing what. Time code, if you have to do any picture conforms, those regions will move, and you just don't drop the ball on anything because you've got a spotting track with a bunch of regions in it that you can send to people. Here's a very subtle sound that will probably be covered by Foley if it's cued for them. If you're on a budget or you're not sure if they're going to get the exact right sound, it's sometimes better to just cut it by hand. That also gives you, the mixer, or the director some options. If they don't like what was delivered in Foley, or the production doesn't quite get it, where they want it, then hey, what about this? I've got these tracks available to me. So this is a subtle one, but there's a pill dropped in some champagne.
Kitty needs some champagne.
So with the production, it's masked, but here it is soloed. And you'll notice I put this sound on my A tracks. These are like what I call the common everyday tracks. So they're going to have the more boring sound effects on it. But doors don't always have to be boring. I'll play just the production sound of this door, which they actually kind of looped to cover the shot. So that's production sound. That is the background ambience that I've cut, and no hard sound effects. So one more time. So yeah, there's sound there from the production effects, but it really needs to, hit hard. So I've got both mono and stereo layers here just to spread that sound out over the left and right speakers along with the center channel. That will help the mixer, because putting everything through one channel, you get a bunch of different frequencies and sounds that build up, and it just turns to mush. It really falls apart. So cut as few layers as you need to make the sound work, and then don't be afraid to add some stereo layers, because you can always bring those in to the center channel to make them not so stereo, but you can't take a mono sound and really make it stereo. All you can do is mess with your center channel divergence. And so you want to give, some flexibility there for the mixer. Here it is one more time, just the hard effects that I cut. There's some really nice rattling in low end, especially when the door hits the wall. In the same scene, we do have some gunshots, and gunshots are, some people will end up cutting a high layer, a mid layer, a low layer, a thump layer, a dry fire, 7 or more layers for a gunshot. For me, once I find the right sound, I'm done. I don't need to add a bunch of layers. If the mixer needs to adjust the EQ to get a little more bass out of it, they've got EQs for that. I don't want them having to go through, 7 or 8 layers just to get a good gunshot. Sometimes you have to do that. If you're making a sound from scratch that isn't just a standard kind of, pistol firing, or rifle, then yeah, add some cool stuff. You can also do that for creative intent. For emotional stuff, you can add some layers underneath the shot to make it sound just a little bit, otherworldly or a little off. Animal sounds are great for that. Thunder, sometimes I'll add thunder if I need the shot to ring out outside, for that long rifle crack where it goes and you just hear it echo. For this, all I've got is I've got a dry fire. I've got a shell casing hitting the ground, and then I've got one mono and one stereo layer, and all together it sounds like this. I do have some bullet impacts too, which you'll see I've split off. So I've got the door. This sequence goes A for the door, B for the gun, C for the gore, the squishy gore stuff, and I've got some blood dripping here. These are on my D tracks. There's these light leaks that happen throughout the film. So I've used a Polaroid 600, a VHS, and then some other analog type sounds to just kind of bridge those cuts. So that's on D. I showed you the door that's on A. Gunshot is on B, and then I've got gore on C. So that should give enough flexibility for the mixer to, quickly jump between those tracks. One thing I like to do when there's a really busy sequence with a lot of cuts or a lot of action is to try to treat each shot as its own little scene. So if you have a bunch of sounds just stacked up on top of each other and it's just a cacophony, people have a really hard time with that. There's only so much your ears can absorb at once. But if you string them out linearly to where your ears only having to listen to, one sound at a time, really, even though they might be just like 5 frames of one sound, 2 frames of another, if they come in a rhythm like that where they come right after another, almost like, you're doing double strokes on a snare drum, you can pick out the individual sounds a lot easier than if it's just a bunch of just chaos just thrown at you. So for any action scene, just try to remember, go frame by frame, make sure you're covering each shot. And if you try to make each shot its own individual moment, then the mix is easier and it also tells a story more versus it just being, well, I'm just going to throw a bunch of sound in here. Here's a really short sequence with this car. We're outside, we're inside, it's cutting back and forth, it's pulling up, it's stopping. And this type of sequence can be really difficult to cut if you don't have the right sound in your library. I'm not even using the right car for this. I couldn't find this car to record, so I just used a It's a Ford LTD, so it's a pretty old vehicle. It's got I think a 351 Windsor V8, and it's basically an older station wagon type car, so it should match this sedan pretty well. But the important thing to have is different mics. So I'll show you in my library. I believe I bought this from Pole Position, the Pole Position library. So let me just type in Ford LTD. So the cool thing about these libraries, the really professional ones will have like up to 16 mics on the car, outside the car, in the engine, by the exhaust, but they do these long takes. So for example, this is 1 minute and 5 seconds for this. This is a CSS5. But if I go down here, take 3, and I do, let's listen to the intake. It's the same length. In the exhaust, that's a different sound. And I also know it cuts inside. And because these are raw recordings and they haven't been edited and cleaned up, you do have to, kind of go in and massage them a little bit. But all I did for this scene here is just drag, all the mics that I need. So I need this one. I'm going to do the intake. If you combine the intake and exhaust, it can give you a really nice tone. And then I also need some approach for the exteriors. And then if you take all these and drag them, I'll just put them on these tracks for now. Actually, these are monos, so let's go those. I'll put those right here. I'll do the interior on the stereo track. And I'm doing control-click to just align the beginning of them. And then I also wanted this one. So these are all from take 3. So, all right, let's do that. And now let's make this bigger. All right, thank you, Sound Miner. So if I listen to all these together, like that's one take. And it's really cool because I can go through, listen to the intake, the exhaust, here's the interior, and then here's the exterior approach and by. And the reason I have this checkerboarded this way is because I've found the parts that I wanted for this, that matched what was going on in picture, whether they're accelerating, decelerating, approaching, and then just diced out like, well, when I'm outside, you can see here I still have the inside sound. I have it muted though in case I want to add a little bit of that just so the cuts aren't so hard, but I've got the region muted, but I'm using the engine left, the exhaust, and then an ORTF, just one channel of the ORTF because I wanted this mic sounded really good, but I don't want necessarily the stereo spread. I can do the stereo spread with reverb because they're in an alley. And then when it cuts inside, you see I've checkerboarded the intake, exhaust, and the exterior sound because I might want to keep some of that. But I've put it on this second set of tracks so that it's really easy to just grab these 3 faders and drag them up or down. I could even put these onto my D tracks or my B tracks if there wasn't anything on there. And then if that just goes for each shot. So we're inside, we're outside. It takes a while to do that, and you just have to take it shot by shot, figure out where the throttle's at and where you can make changes, because like on gear shifts, you can change to different parts of the file, but just to play it all together. This is car. I also added a siren because even though it's not, like a cruiser, it is a detective car, and you can even see the lights flashing there. So here's just the car. Notice there's a car door close, and I believe I put this on A. That way that can be adjusted separately. You could hear there's a skid here. The siren does change from exterior to interior, but I matched the pitches so that it didn't bump. So these are two different recordings, but there's just one inside and one outside. And I have these checkerboarded and muted so that if for whatever reason the director said, no, I don't want the interior sound, then it would be easily undoable. I've also got some bumps here because they go over this little dip. And then skids. This skid I let it ride over into the next shot because then I've got this mono track. Generally for interior, when you're inside the car, more stereo layers is fine because, you know, when you're in the car, it kind of resonates through the cab and it does feel like it's around you versus outside. Unless you're really close, mono sounds are a little bit easier to mix because you can pan them. You can do stereo if you wanted to, but this is just kind of how I like to cut it. And then same with the siren, I already went over that. Got the skids. The skid, with all the electric cars coming out, there's a bunch of really nice libraries that have just tires on asphalt, start, stop, skids. There's a little bit of whine from the electric motor, but generally once you add a real car motor on top of that, it kind of goes away. And it'll be interesting to see how cutting cars changes as we get more of the electric cars. Here's this sequence one more time. And I'm kind of a gearhead, so that part of me always wants it to be the actual car sound, but it doesn't always work. There's not always that car locally to record, or there's not always a library of it, and then sometimes it just doesn't sound right. Sometimes you put in a V8 sound for a four-banger, and, you know, all the gearheads cringe at that, but it fits the story better, and, you know, sometimes it pays to not be such a nerd about all that stuff. Okay, should probably cover our scene we're working on. Really, I think the only sound effects I covered was, you know, it's 2 minutes long. I've already cut backgrounds for it. I think I covered just the phone, really. So there's a phone pickup. I've got that on a separate track than the dialing. And I did match the numbers to what she's dialing, which took some time. And then I've got a old 1940s phone ring here.
You should have seen that French fuck's face explode.
Come on, Jack, pick up.
You're playing with fire. Hello?
It's
I did change the timing of it a little bit just to sound more realistic because the way it was originally cut, I'll just play the guide track for you. It didn't feel right.
You should have seen that French fuck's face explode.
Come on, Jack, pick up.
You're playing with fire. Hello?
And we'll see what the director says about that. He might not like it, but I kind of like it the way I cut it better. Where the phone, the big change really is just after we hear it doing a foot string through the receiver, the way Kitty hears it in this shot. Really, right when we cut back, I moved the regular ring earlier to motivate him getting up.
You're playing with fire.
This is just a scene between Alec and Kitty, and it's pretty emotional, but he's abusing her. He's moving her around, and so I added some rattles and stuff of the set and the props that I know Foley will cover as long as it's cued, but I just wanted to make sure it was a really specific sound that I added. So what I'll do is, let me get rid of that extra layer to make this easy. I'll just play it without these layers. and then play it with them in. There's also supposed to be food cooking here, so I added some sizzling sound.
What are you doing?
Blow me.
What?
You heard me.
Dinner's almost ready.
You suck everyone else off.
Stop.
So good they send you flowers.
You're hurting me.
Come
Ow!
on.
Ow!
Suck it!
So there's some production sound in there of her bumping into stuff, but here it is with the added layers.
What are you doing?
Blow me.
What?
You heard me.
Dinner's almost ready.
You suck everyone else off.
Stop.
So good they send you flowers.
You're hurting me.
Come
Ow!
on.
Ow!
Suck it! Come on, suck.
And then I'll just show you just the extra layers. Little cloth pat, those are always nice for domestics. And just the fridge moving, and then some cloth whooshes and just stuff getting moved around. It's nice to have that stuff, even if it gets taken out. It's so easy to mute something. What's not easy is when you're mixing with the director and they're like, we need a sound for this, and you guys didn't do anything. Then, you're under the gun and you're not going to do your best work. So if you cut too much, you can always mute it. Maybe this doesn't work, or you can leave it in, let the mixer and director decide, or just, come back to it on another pass and refine it further. So there's whoosh and punch here. And these are actually peaking my meter a little bit. So I'll clip gain them down. This is another spot where a lot of sound effects editors will do multiple layers. I used to do 4 layers for each hit, not including the whoosh. So a thump, a low, a mid, and a high. And then the whoosh would be the 5th layer. And then the gore would be separate. But what I found when I mixed stuff like that, and I mixed tracks from sound designers and sound editors who just put all kinds of layers, is again, all that stuff going to the center channel, it just adds up to be noise, and it starts to either hit the limiter with all the different frequencies, and you have to go in and like EQ every single clip and make sure, one's just lows and one's just highs, and you have to maybe compress a little bit, and you have to limit a little bit to get it to really, really, slap on the speakers. And what I started to do is it's just say, well, no, I like this one layer. This one layer by itself, when I solo, it sounds really good. So why am I adding all these other layers just to give some flexibility for the mixer? No, if it sounds good, it is good. If you can get by with one layer on your punches, use one layer. If you need 2, that's fine. You shouldn't need to just stack layers. If you're stacking that many layers deep, where there are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 layers deep just to get a good sound, it's not the right sound, and it will never be the right sound. So go back to square one and just find the right sound. When you find the right sound, you can play it by itself and it sounds good. You don't have to say, well, when it gets mixed, it'll sound good. No, find the right sound, cut it in, use that, and it will sound good with everything else because you're using less layers. It's a linear progression of sounds that makes the most impact. So on this frame, right, I'll show you where. Here. Okay, I've got a punch sound, right? I'm just going to put a marker here, and I'm going to do P for punch. Now, I've seen this where people have the punch, and they've got the crunch, and they've got the squirt, and they've got the grunt of the guy, if they're cutting that in, all on the same frame. And you have to spread them out a little bit, even by just 2 frames. Let's focus on this one punch right here. We've got the production muted, the background's muted. Okay, just this one. Waka, waka. So the whoosh happens 2 frames before the punch. I'm going to move this whoosh over 2 frames, so it's going to happen right with the punch. And I'm going to move this bone crack over to where it happens all on this frame right here. Bam, they're all happening at the same place. Right? So now I'm going to hit undo a bunch of times, put it back where it was. See, that's a more interesting sound versus So just spreading the sounds out a frame or two gives you a lot more depth and some rhythm to it too, which is super important to have rhythm. And also, I should show this, the guide track, you know, they had their own punches in here, which weren't great, but they're also not timed with the action. And how you can tell where to have this. They shot this scene with the normal shutter speed. A lot of action stuff is shot with a much higher shutter speed, so you can see every frame like a still picture. If it's normal shutter speed, stuff will get blurry when it's moving fast. Helps you cut, but maybe, you know, it doesn't look as good for action. So he's blurry, 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 bam. See how the cloth there turns sharp? I'll make this a little bigger so it's easier. So blurry, 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 and then that's sharp. So that's where you put the impact sound. And you can even see visual effects did the same thing, right? Where he turns sharp. They might have even cut a frame out of this. That's where you'll put the impact. Same thing works if you're cutting footsteps and you're watching somebody's shoulders, where you see the cloth turn sharp and like hang in the air for a second. That's where you put the step. All right, there's a little drug montage here where I've got some very simple sound design. And you can see I don't have a ton of layers, but each shot has its own type of sound. So instead of having, you know, 8 layers deep, let the mixer sort it out on the dub stage, I was really specific about what sounds I wanted. I even processed some of them, and I'll be adding one more, but I'll just play you what I've got so far. I do have a bag that I cut here with the boom. I'm just going to hide some of these tracks so that it's a little easier to see them all at once. So this glitch at the end was made using H delay, and I'll show you how I made it. So the raw sound sounds like this. I thought that was cool because it had kind of a ringy sound to it, but also had that the LFO. I like H delay because it acts kind of like my analog delay pedal for guitars. So if you go ping pong, it'll make stereo. You don't need it to be host, just set it to milliseconds. Okay, so there's not a ton of feedback, right? But watch what happens if you bring this up towards 100%. It'll start to self-oscillate. Yeah, this analog will add some white noise, which I was probably just messing with it and then thought, you know, that's kind of cool. It creates like a little bit of a wash to it. So that's pretty close. So, and then I did reverb it out. So this is just processed. You can use altiverb or revibe or, you know, deverb. It doesn't really matter. It's really just to give you a tail that just kind of washes out. And for a lot of these, I'll do 100% processing if I just want the tail, and I'll bring it down to a second track so that it's just easier to have a little separation. Also makes it nice because you can pan it. In 5.1, you just grab the panner and just bring it to the rears or take it left to right across the room. So what I feel like this is missing, though, is some kind of low frequency. I don't want it to be a tonal sound. I just want it to be noise. And this is an analog synth I'll be using, so let me just... So that's starting to not sound so like I'm, playing a keyboard. I'm going to patch the LFO to be pitch. That's just an LFE sweetener, so I'll label that. Some sound effects editors will cut an LFE track or a couple dedicated LFE tracks so that the low frequency material just goes to the LFE. You can do that. I like to keep it on the full range tracks and use sends when I mix for that. That way it doesn't just go to the LFE, and if the LFE gets dropped on a stereo down mix, that material's not there. It'll at least make it to the left and right channels on a stereo down mix, even if the LFE is completely dropped. So here's all together with that little analog synth sublayer. And I found that if I can get my hands on something to create sounds and try to match, like there I brought I opened the filter up while it went to white. Even though it's basically just noise that's going to be thumping in LFE, that little tiny bit of performance will end up adding a lot to the overall, if you multiply that times 100 times throughout a film, it's enough to add real artistry to the sound effects where it elevates it beyond just dragging stuff from a library. So keep that in mind. Anytime you can add a little bit of yourself into the film with a performance, provided it's not pulling away from the story, you don't want it to just be about you and the sound. But if you can add that little extra, something special to it, it will go from just a sound edit session to, real sound design. All right, so that about covers our hard effects and sound design for this. I'm not going to go through every scene of the movie. That would take a really long time. But if you have any questions, go ahead and comment below. And we didn't cover Foley. Next week, I will go over some Foley recorded for this film by the good people at Post Red Studios. And I'll also talk a little bit about what if you don't have a Foley budget? You need to record some very specific sounds that weren't captured on set. So how do you do that? So tune in for that. And as always, thanks for watching.